Three, two, and one. And good morning, and welcome to another U.S. Tech Workers podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Lynn. I am the founder of U.S. Tech Workers, and today I am joined by author and blogger and tech worker, Hilarie Gamm. Hilarie just published a book, Billions Lost. I cannot recommend this book enough to our community because it really gets into the history of the predicament many U.S. tech workers find themselves in. So, Hilarie, welcome.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Well, it is great to have you here. There has been an awful lot going on in the tech front. There's four things I really want to talk to you today about. And they are, and I'll go ahead and read my list here. They are the Business Roundtable letter that went out on August 22nd to the Director of Homeland Security. I want to talk about the H-4 visa program, and that's one of the things that the powers that be mentioned in this Business Roundtable letter. The Yoder amendment, that is still ongoing and a cause for concern for tech workers, and why it's important for us to be restricting these employment visas. So the letter was sent by whom to who, Hilarie?
You know, the letter was sent to Kristen Nielsen, who works for Francis Cissna, Homeland Security, and it was sent by many of America's well-known corporations. Business Roundtable chairman is Jamie Dimon, J.P. Morgan Chase.
Say no more.
Yeah, Chuck Robbins, I think, is the chair of the Immigration Committee, and he's responsible as CEO of Cisco. And I think, you know, browsing through all the names you see, it's, you know, Cisco, it's Coca-Cola, it's PepsiCo, it's American Airlines. I mean, well-known companies, Bank of America, AT&T, Boston Consulting Group, BlackRock, you know, the list, you know, basically goes on. And of course, Cognizant, the largest H-1B purveyor in the country, was listed, as well as IBM and HP, who both employ more technology workers outside the U.S. than they do within the U.S. as of today in 2018. Mm-hmm. And other well-known companies like Johnson & Johnson, and, you know, the NASDAQ, Morgan Stanley, MasterCard, you know, Marriott, and also Wipro, which is another company similar to Cognizant that makes its money based on outsourcing and using foreign technology labor rather than U.S. labor. So lots of companies.
What was the crux of this letter, Hilarie? In your opinion, what were they trying to get the Director of Homeland Security to do?
Yeah, so just to mention a couple other names, because I don't want to leave them out. There's Salesforce, which is like one of the biggest drivers of the NASDAQ today is Salesforce.
It's one of the FANG stock companies. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then there was also Prudential Financial, you know, S&P, Pitney Bowes, which is, you know, a very old U.S. company with history of employing a lot of Americans. Western Union, you know, how people send money, was also one of the signers. Texas Instruments, Visa, Tyson, Verizon. So really just a whole slew of companies signed this letter. The gist of the letter was basically to ask Homeland Security to not necessarily...
They addressed it to the Honorable Kristen M. Nielsen, Secretary, Department of Homeland Security. So it went right to her.
Right. And also Apple CEO Tim Cook was also, I think, one of the signers, right? Which is one of, again, America's largest technology companies, both hardware and software. I believe, you know, they named several different items, right? Some actions taken in 2017 and 2018. I'm not sure if you want to kind of go through, ask me about each one. One of the paragraphs I wrote in here had to do with inconsistent government action. So with the way the government works, with every organization in the government, having had a lot of experience in dealing with government regulations in some various industries,
Right,
they always
because
issue.
specifically it said inconsistent government action and uncertainty undermines economic growth and American competitiveness and creates anxiety for employees. And I want to talk to you about that term, employees, who follow the law. In many cases, these employees studied here and received degrees from U.S. universities, often in critical STEM fields.
Right. So a couple things. Every time the U.S. government offers guidance for anything that they do, there's all kinds of compliance officers who work in every industry who are always trying to interpret the law. That's just the way it works. That's status quo. That's not particular to immigration or technology jobs or H-1B visas or F-1 visas or L-1 visas. It's just across the board. Any government
every piece
agency.
of legislation requires that, right?
Yeah, it requires people who are experts in that field who can interpret it and try to, internalize the guidance and do the right thing for their entity. So that's like a nonsensical sentence that they put in there in terms of every day working with the government.
And what gets me about that paragraph, and I'm glad you brought that up, is, here they're concerned about the anxiety of their employees. But what about the 200 employees at Northeast Utilities that were displaced in one fell swoop, or Disney, or SoCal Edison? What about the anxiety caused to those loyal U.S. citizen employees, very diverse employee bodies as well?
Right. So to be more specific, right, let's talk about the signers of the letter and their employees. So originally, their employees were American citizens. Originally, their technology employees were also American citizens who would have studied in the U.S., who are law-abiding citizens, who follow, the rules and regulations of living in the United States in terms of paying state and federal taxes, who are voting and supporting their state and federal government.
And more importantly, as citizens, and not just consumers, citizens, they have a responsibility to other citizens, to their communities, to be involved, to interact, to be part of a democracy.
Exactly. So employees are one thing, but to have employees who are citizens is something I think we all strive for as Americans.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought that up. Because
just to be clear, Kevin, you named a couple companies, but refer to the list that we have in front of us based on because I think you have the letter open, right? The letter that was written.
I do have. I'm looking American Express Company,
right?
ADP,
so what
American
happens is
Airlines, all companies. Many of them I use, and frankly, I don't want to use anymore, knowing that their position on this issue.
Well, it's not just their position, and this is why I want to make sure, when we're having this discussion and the folks listening to the U.S. Tech Workers podcast are listening to this message, I want it to resonate with them. I understand that American Airlines is hiring technology workers that are not American citizens, that American Airlines once had a U.S.-based technology workforce, and now it's an international-based technology workforce. I understand that's the case for American Express. I understand that's the case for, every one of these companies that you list here. So even though there wasn't a lawsuit against Coca-Cola, even there wasn't a lawsuit against Bank of America, those American citizens who are employed for these entities listed here on this letter lost their job to first visa workers within the U.S., and then to a captive workforce that took over from the visa workers that sits offshore. And so where we have technology that enables work to be done outside the U.S., and where we have no regulations associated with our U.S. data, these jobs will continue to stream out of the U.S. and be able to be done by anybody, not necessarily an American citizen. And that's the crux of my response to the Honorable Kristen Nielsen and the Department of Homeland Security And I think that's the message that every American technology worker should bring to their congressman and their senator, and should get engaged with U.S. tech workers, and just understand that they have a voice, and their American citizenship enables them to have that voice and let their voice be heard, so that everybody in Washington understands that these jobs are leaving the U.S. and these folks are left without employment opportunities.
Now, I'm going to put up a link to this on the podcast, on the YouTube page, so that people can find your letter and perhaps use it as guidance. But in closing on this part of our podcast, I do want to read one of your paragraphs, and it's the third paragraph. And you state, in 2018, the labor participation rate remains low and unchanged year over year. Wage stagnation persists. These circumstances are a direct result of the sheer magnitude of foreign workers employed in the U.S. that what were once secure and high-paying U.S. professions. Over 125,000 certified H-1B visas have been issued to the corporate signers of the August 22nd letter in the year 2015, 2016, and 2017. Additionally, many of those same corporations have replaced their domestic white-collar professionals with hundreds of thousands of captive white-collar workers in foreign lands. It is in their best interest that the U.S. continues to allow the displacement of white-collar American professionals for cheap foreign labor. I think that's a brilliant paragraph, Hilarie, and thank you for that letter. And frankly, thank you for the kind of work you've been doing over the last couple of years.
Oh, thanks. And thank you, Kevin. It's a tough fight. We're all trying to do what we can to help our fellow American citizens and to help our national security and the future generations of America. And I continue to gain a lot of inspiration and a lot of energy from the good work that U.S. Tech Workers is doing. And I really hope folks listen to this podcast, join U.S. Tech Workers, and start to have a voice, in Washington, and let our leaders know that we need jobs. We spend money on education, spend money on our children's education, and we need jobs.
Huge money. And that's another racket we'll have to save for another day. I do want to talk to you about the H-4 visa program. And I was doing an interview with a reporter from the New York Times. And after about an hour, in her frustration, she said, well, what about the woman in the golden cage? And I said, well, what do you mean the woman in the golden cage? Well, the spouses of people here on visas who aren't allowed to work. And I started doing my research, and I found out that, if we were to allow these spouses to work the first year, that would be about 155,000 jobs right there, and 55,000 on consecutive years. And this is at a time, as you aptly mentioned in your letter, of extremely low labor participation force rates. What is your take on this H-4, and why this drive to have an H-4 program?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Being a wife and being a spouse, I think that I have a good perspective on the need for American citizens who are spouses to be able to be engaged in the workforce. I think that basically the numbers that you gave are very, very low estimates of the true impact the H-4 spouse visa program would have in the U.S. So there's about, even though the visa cap per year, I think, is 65,000, and then it goes to 85,000 for those extra 20,000 visas that are given to people with master's degrees. Mm-hmm. So normally more visas are provided than the actual cap year over year.
There's no caps for nonprofits, government, universities, things of that nature.
Right, exactly. So for the past 20 years, we've seen visa numbers, in excess of 100,000 year over year. So, in 10 years, that's a million visa workers here in the U.S. Because what happens is they're here on a visa, whether it's an H-1B or an L-1 or an F-1 or an H-4 potentially, and they get that visa, and then it continues to be renewed. So it's quite a huge number of visas.
Time. Mm-hmm.
Yep, and many times the visa folks that come here on visas kind of disappear. The government doesn't even track where those visa holders are. So many times they're living in the United States even when their visas have expired. So the H4 initiative to give spouses of workers that come here on H-1B visa is really a twofer, right? It's 2-for-1. So you know, if that's the case, then every American company or corporation, right, should be in a situation where if they're relocating an American citizen, that they're also going to enable that spouse to be employed in that same geographic area. You know, one of the biggest you know, ideas that come out against you know, the idea that we have to perpetuate Americans working in American jobs is that Americans don't want to move, that Americans don't
Right.
want to relocate.
I mean,
And so
you
that's why we
purchased
have to
a
bring in,
house, you have your kids in school, you're part of a community. Right.
right. That's partially true. It also has to do with the number of divorces, right? Where 50% of the population is married population ends up being divorced. They share custody. And so it actually, from a legal perspective, makes it much harder to move. But the reality is that many times, in order to survive in today's America, both parents need to be income earners. And so
Yes.
before we give away all the opportunities to the spouses of foreigners, wouldn't we be better served as a country and as a citizenship to first enable the spouses that are also educated, that also have professional experience, that are perhaps caregivers along with being educated professionals, an opportunity to work? I know that's where I feel that the H4 doesn't do the appropriate due diligence for American women. And so if I had been speaking to that reporter in the US, the New York Times, I would have asked to review the statistics related to women in technology and women in the workforce. And, you know, I'm not sure why someone would believe that it's okay for American women to be held back and not be able to be employed, or American men who are the spouses of women who are working full time to not be able to be employed or working. I'm not sure why a foreign woman or spouse of someone coming to the United States on an H-1B should be afforded the H-4 visa before every American spouse who's a citizen has an opportunity for gainful employment if that's their desire.
Excellent. I really appreciate you, you know, illuminating our audience on that issue, and it's a big one. The next thing I'd like to discuss with you, because our time is limited today, Hilarie, for our list, I would say all of my audience is very well aware of what happened on the evening of July 25th in a very surreptitious manner. Certain amendments were snuck into the House Homeland Security Appropriations Bill by Congressman Yoder, Kevin Yoder. He's from the 3rd District in Kansas. He chairs that Appropriations Committee. And he put in several amendments, one of which he called it's his 3rd amendment that he put in. I believe he put in 5. But this one is called the numerical limitation to any single foreign state. And it essentially removes the country caps, the kind of the diversity country caps that we have, so that one country doesn't dominate our work or employment visa and green card processes. And I'd like to get your take on that, because we're at the point now where there's 3 things that we still have to do primarily is 1, fight this in the Rules Committee and hopefully get this amendment stripped out. And if that doesn't happen, put pressure on Congress to fight it on the House floor, and failing that in the Senate. But this amendment was essentially House Resolution 392. It was a bill that was created back in January of 2017 to do exactly what I said. And I'd sure like to get your take on it and your advice and action steps for U.S. tech workers.
Great. I totally agree that the sneaking in, as you so aptly described the inclusion of this particular verbiage was probably not the most upfront idea for the congressman to do in relation to changing the laws and the rules and the regulations about diversity in immigration. So as everyone that's an American citizen can attest, our country is great because of the many different kinds of immigrants and the many different kinds of cultures and backgrounds that our country and our institutions embrace to create success and a capitalistic society where we're able to thrive and grow, be educated, and learn from one another and take the best of every culture and background that each of our immigrant groups has to offer. And so when we think about that and we think about this amendment, we're talking about taking one particular country's immigrants and putting them at the top of the list necessarily in front of so many other countries that have citizens that want to rightfully, legally, and under the laws that have been in place for the past 25 years immigrate to the U.S. And I think it's unfair, and I think it's wrong.
Now, I've heard someone said this, and I'm not sure how accurate it is, but they said if this goes through, for the next 6 years, it will only be people from the country of India receiving work visas and green cards. Is that accurate? Is that hyperbole?
I think India has been such a phenomenal partner for the U.S. and such a great ally in so many ways. The country of India, however, is more than 4 times the size of the U.S. If I remember correctly, India is 1.25 billion population size, and the U.S. is, I think, we're around what,
330 million. Right. Mm-hmm.
So, big difference of numbers. So I think from an India perspective, when they see people leaving India and coming to the U.S., it's this really super small portion of their population. But on the flip side, where our country has such a much smaller population, we would see that as huge numbers coming from one particular group or country. Again, India is the country's largest democracy, and the U.S. is the world's oldest democracy. So we have those democratic roots in common, and I think that's what makes India such a wonderful ally. But allowing one country to stream immigration in over the however many, where there are over 100 other countries in the world where there are citizens who'd like to make immigration to the U.S. is, again, unfair and unjust and is not something that can be allowed. I think the fact that we have such great help from India is a testament to the numbers of folks that have emigrated from India to the U.S. But that shouldn't preclude the diversity quotas that we have put in place to ensure that any immigrants coming to the U.S. follow the rules. And by placing one country above all others and mitigating the opportunity for every other immigrant class from every other country from entering the U.S. legally really would be unfair, and it would be unjust, and it would be un-American. America is about America is certainly about diversity. So suggesting that only one country be allowed to immigrate year after year after year to the U.S. and move to the top of the immigration chain above every other country where we also have strong allies. I would think, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, England, Ireland, South America's countries of Argentina, Venezuela, Canada, all these countries that are allies to the U.S., South Africa, Israel, Italy, even Greece, all these countries, and Australia. I mean, every one of those countries, Singapore, every country, I think, has folks that want to emigrate to the U.S., and none of them would be able to for almost 10 years, for almost a decade.
You would think that there would be a huge backlash, not necessarily from tech workers, but for instance, when I was a delegate to the California Democratic Party, there was an Irish caucus there. There was a Mexican caucus. That you would think these ethnic caucuses and all of these political parties at the state level, at the federal level, would be up in arms about this. And yet I haven't heard anything.
I think probably because they don't know about it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. That gets to one of my fears. I can state, and I've talked to several people in Washington, that Congressman Yoder was not expecting the kind of backlash that he received on this. He thought, oh, I've approved $5 billion for the wall. I can let all of this slide in. But my fear is a lot of the attention is being given to the amendment that was concerning asylum standards and not the amendment that was essentially HR 392, which was the country cap. So my concern is they may walk the asylum standards back into the, walk that cat back into the bag, but this can run through, particularly when you look at the number of people in the Rules Committee that support certain lobbying groups that are strong on Indian immigration. So I'm just a little concerned about that. And I think it's really important for U.S. tech workers to be calling their own congressmen. And we have up on our site and certainly on our Facebook page, who the members of the Rules Committee are, their voting records when it comes to immigration, or their scorecard when it comes to immigration topics, and what certain interest groups that they belong to are also there. So I think it's really important for everyone to take a look at that information.
Absolutely. And I would suggest to anyone listening to the podcast today that they reach out to you or I directly. Certainly anyone can reach out to me, send me an email, and I will help engage them with their congressman and help engage them with U.S. tech workers and hear their story and make sure that, we do communicate and inform our fellow countrymen as to what's going on with suggested laws and regulations and how we can affect positive change. Every American has a voice, every American has a vote, and every American has the absolute right to contact their congressman and senator and let them know that they believe that diversity is more important in immigration than allowing one particular group of immigrants to be the sole owners of new American citizenship for a decade. And that's basically what the Yoder Amendment 392 suggests and would create a situation where that was the case. And I know that if we get everybody listening and their siblings and their friends and their spouses and their parents calling their congressmen and senators and letting them know this is not acceptable, we'd be able to put a stop to it.
I would hope so. And that's the importance that I place on organizing. When we started U.S. Tech Workers earlier this year, initially, we created our H-1B database in order to learn more about the scope of the issue. I've come to find that some 69, this was reported back in March by the Migration Policy Institute, a group that is not necessarily favorable to our outlook on work visas and immigration, but they stated that 69% of U.S. tech jobs were now being held by an H-1B visa worker. I mean, this is an amazing amount of displacement, really kind of allows us to segue into my next topic, which is, why is it important to fight these employment visas and why we really need to create this political movement that will force and keep Congress's feet to the fire?
Well, without it, I think we'll lose the opportunity to employ white-collar professionals in the next century, right? In the 21st century, the opportunity for employment within the U.S. will be gone. And that's a very important message for every American to understand, that the money they're spending on their child's education, the money they spend on their own education, will yield no results in terms of gainful, lifelong, meaningful employment if we don't start shedding some light on what's going on in the U.S.
Right, because I think a job is just becoming more and more scarce. And aside from employment visas and immigration. We also have AI. I've seen reports where they believe in 20 years, 50% of all jobs just won't exist. They'll be done by artificial intelligence. That alone should be getting us to retool our views on immigration, retool our views on work and education. There's so much that we need to be looking at. And I think what we're doing when you look at things like these amendments by Congressman Yoder, the letter from the Business Roundtable, we're going in the wrong direction when it comes to the best interests of the U.S. citizen.
And the country and our infrastructure and our democracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to have meaningful work. One of the things I write about in my book is the hollowing out of the middle class. So as we allow the exodus of our data and the exodus of our white-collar professions to leave the U.S., we're hollowing out the middle class, the most important, really the most important class of our American society, because they're the binding force. They're how people relate to one another. They're the stabilizing force of the economy, because you have those that are in the lower wage earners who are trying to move up into the middle class. And quite frankly, low wage earners are affected by J-1 visas, as middle class workers are affected by H-1 and L-1 visas.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very important for people to understand that American students are affected by the F-1 visa as much as the workers that are working against the tide in terms of finding good jobs in the U.S. American students are finding it hard to get good placements at universities because there's so much foreign competition, again, made available to those foreign students through the F-1 visa. So there's pressure on every socioeconomic portion of our society today because of the immigration policies that have been put in place and remain in place. And it affects the ability for the country to succeed, and affects our national security. If we don't have enough children going into the tech field and making money and enjoying it and working in it, we are hampering our ability as a nation to succeed in the digital age. And that is the most important message for Washington. We need critical mass so that we can ensure the country's prowess on the international stage. And that's the most important message I can leave with your listeners, is that this isn't just about one individual job or one individual family that is destroyed because their wage earner has lost the opportunity to work in the U.S. This is about an entire nation of children who need to be able to be engaged educationally and be able to be engaged in a digital society where they understand the ramifications of their data privacy, where they understand how hacking works and how vulnerable their finances and their personal information is, and where we protect our nation from a national security and a strategic perspective to keep everyone in the United States who's here safe. And that's why it's so important that we educate and we employ Americans, especially in the technology field.
Yeah, that's a brilliant thing. And I just want to ask you one thing, because you have talked about how, you know, the H-1B visa worker that we'll see here, they're just the tip of the iceberg. There are hundreds of thousands of U.S. tech work or U.S. tech jobs that are being performed overseas. So these are jobs Americans have never seen. It's our data, it's our systems, but they reside overseas, being serviced by non-U.S. citizens, and hence Americans haven't even gotten to the first base to take a crack at those jobs.
Well, what's happened over the course of 25 years, which began with the Y2K scare, is that there was a mass exodus of jobs out of the U.S. in the technology sector specifically. You know, they were the leaders in sending jobs offshore because they wanted to make money and they didn't want to be bound by the need to pay Americans high wages. And so they looked for a cheaper labor source, and they enabled the 1990 First Immigration Act, right, which opened up that H-1B vehicle. And that happened specifically to mitigate risks associated with year 2000 coding changes. What happened because of that is that companies got into the paradigm of having workers sitting in another land. So initially, the jobs that went offshore had to do with testing. But now the jobs that are going offshore have to do with everything that services a company. When people talk about tech jobs in the US, they think about technology companies or high-tech companies. Yes, those companies are using H-1B visas, and yes, those companies do have workforces all over the world. But what I'm talking about, when I talk about the number of jobs, millions of jobs that are now not in the United States, when I talk about the mass exodus and the progression for an H-1B to captive, I'm talking about companies and industries that are non-technology related. I'm talking about banks, insurance companies, healthcare companies, hospitals, publishing companies, marketing companies, auditors. All of those companies have technology workers, or did. They all employed technology workers to answer customer service questions, or to help somebody with their computer, or to build the applications that make their companies run, or to build the artificial intelligence applications to enable growth and prosperity of that corporation, or to build the technology that's effectively helping manufacturing facilities manufacture cars or sewing machines or video games faster and better.
Wow.
So what happens is that all of those jobs are leaving or have already left the US, because initially it's an H-1B visa holder here in the US who manages a cheaper labor source in India or Costa Rica or China or South Africa. But once that particular situation is enabled, then the corporation decides they want to save more money. They don't want to use a consulting services company for their H-1B visa labor or their offshore labor. They want to hire technology workers directly. So then they engage in a partnership with an offshore supplier in one of these countries, the Philippines, Mexico, wherever. And what they do is they set up a technology shop. The US workers get laid off or early retired in a very slow, dripping fashion, where it's 5, 10, 50 workers in different states without a lot of fanfare, while the foreign technology force is being built up over time.
Because it really is about, there are no such things as unskilled jobs. Every job requires some skill. And as you progress in it, you acquire skills and experience, and you go up the rungs. You take out these rungs, and what do?
Exactly. So that's the hollowing out of the middle class. So the only thing left are the very high-paid executives who send all these jobs outside the U.S., or the low-wage, minimum wage workers who are being squeezed out. That's why when you look at why minimum wage workers are not moving up the socioeconomic ladder, they're getting squeezed in two ways. White-collar professionals are having to take jobs at a coffee shop and become a barista, even though they're super overqualified, right? Taking an opportunity away from a low-income worker because they are unable to find a white-collar job in the U.S. anymore. And at the same time, in many geographic locations in the U.S., those minimum wage workers are being squeezed out by illegal immigrants who are able to be employed and take jobs that are also at that low wage earner scale. And if anybody lived, 20 or 30 years ago in the U.S., they remember, and the statistics, support this fact, that in previous generations in the U.S., teenagers were a huge workforce.
Yes, summer work was always there, but it's not that way anymore.
Right, because parents are it's for several reasons. Parents are so focused on making sure their kids get into school because there's so much pressure from the F1 foreign visa students pressuring the university system, the university level, positions. And then from a timing perspective, they're trying to build up their resumes to get into college. They don't feel like they don't have the time to work.
but when I lived in Los Angeles, it was also, for instance, whether it's a car wash or a restaurant, they would rather have someone, preferably an illegal immigrant, working there where there's no real liability. You know, a 17-year-old injures themselves on the job, there's liability. They would prefer not to
Yeah,
have that.
you're absolutely right. And what's so interesting, we'll just close it out with this, is that in the age of technology, where technology is in every teenager's hand in the US today, the best thing that they can do to tamp down the ill effects of technology in their face, living in the digital world, is to work and interface with other human beings and learn how to
Yes,
be responsible, respectful, and show up for a job every day. That's what America was built on, and that's the America I hope for the future of our country and for the generations that are being educated today and every future generation of Americans. I hope the work ethic is instilled and resurfaces, and I'm hoping for the best. And immigration, legal immigration, has, and the rules and regulations we talked about today have a lot to do with getting us where we need to be.
well, Hilarie, I always learn so much when we sit down and talk. Your book, Billions Lost, is an absolute must read. I can't promote your book enough. It is just filled with enormously, just fantastic number. It's fact ridden. It's easy to read. It's digestible. So we're coming up on the Labor Day weekend, 3-day weekend for many people. Read Billions Lost. Hilarie, thanks again for joining me today. I know it means a lot to our U.S. tech worker audience every time you come on, because again, you really alert us to the key issues of the moment and keep us focused on the long term, on what the big game is. So, Hilarie, thanks for joining me and have a great day.
Thanks, Kevin. You too. And thank you to all the U.S. tech workers for supporting all workers in the U.S. Thank you again, Kevin. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Wonderful. Have a great day, Hilarie. And
Okay,
to our
bye.
bye-bye. And to our U.S. tech workers, please share this podcast. And for those of you joining us for the first time, if you like it, give us a thumbs up. Also, click on the links, go to the U.S. Tech Workers site, sign up and like our Facebook page, stay in touch and be part of the movement. Have a great day. Bye-bye.